Hi class! In the last video, we learned a little bit more about different types of assessments. And one of the main goals of assessment is to help clarify diagnosis. So we're now going to be talking about diagnosis and the different models of diagnosis that we have. So first of which, one of the assessments that we often use is the ASEVA, or ASEVA. This is a checklist of different types of behaviors that children may experience from 3 years of age to 18 years of age. And one of the things that we get out of that is scores on these different dimensions. So children could be normal or higher in anxiety symptoms, for example. Or they could also have normal levels to higher levels of aggressive behaviors. And so at the end of this, what we get is a dimensional model. That means that there is no cut and dry categories that we use, but instead it's on a continuum. And we get things like these internalizing and externalizing problems, which you've now seen a couple of times in your readings and in a previous video. They also have these other types of problems that may occur with children that don't fit under these two broader categories, but just to kind of simplify it, we're just really going to focus here on these internalizing and externalizing problems. So those internalizing problems are very interdirected. Basically, this is anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, and again, children are on a range. They can be in a normal range, or they can be in something that we say is abnormal because it's much higher than most other children's. Externalizing problems are more outer directed. So this may be things like, having more attention difficulties, but really thinking about that hyperactivity, maybe rule-breaking behaviors, or even aggression. So this is one way that we can figure out what's happening with children and give us a range and say whether or not that's in the normal range or the abnormal range, right? Whether or not it is typical or deviant for that age range and for the characteristics of children, so either boys or girls, and whether or not it's different. So at the end of this, you won't get a straightforward diagnosis. So just taking this measure, you're just going to receive this kind of broader, hey, this child seems to be higher on internalizing versus externalizing behaviors. To get a full diagnosis, we actually have to have a categorical model. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is now in its 5th edition, and this is what we use in the United States. Other countries are going to use different things, although this is used in some countries versus others. So one of the guiding principles behind this categorical model is either you have or you don't have a disorder. So just as an example, in order to get a diagnosis using the DSM-5 of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you have to have 6 symptoms of inattention, or 6 or more symptoms of inattention that occur before 16 years of age. They have to be present for at least 6 months in time, and they're inappropriate for a developmental level. So you need to meet all of that, as well as either distress or dysfunction. So it really says, hey, if that child has all these symptoms but it's not causing them distress or dysfunction, then they don't have ADHD. If they instead have 5 symptoms of inattention, they might not meet criteria. So the categorical model is either yes, you have it, or no, you don't have it. We know that this gives us some advantages, right? Parsimony is this idea that this is the easiest way to conceptualize these things. We know that there are certain types of symptoms that hang together, and that oftentimes once we see these attention symptoms, we often we'll also see these other types of symptoms happening too. Or if we think about depression, oftentimes when we see that high negative affectivity and depressed mood, we often see things like trouble with sleeping. This also helps us facilitate communication. So it is much easier for me to say, this child has depression, than saying this child has high levels of internalizing disorders or internalizing symptoms based on yada, yada, yada criteria, right? If I were to, have a referral to a psychiatrist, to maybe a school, I could just say this child meets criteria for depression. Cut and dry, it's very simple. The other thing that diagnosis does is that this really helps us determine treatment and prognosis. So what should we expect for a child who's diagnosed with depression? What are the best treatments available for depression itself? And then also, what do we expect to happen later on in life for that child? So we know that depression is a recurring disorder. So typically, once you get your first depressive episode, it typically recurs over time. So you will recover from it, and then you might have another one. This also helps us to gain special services. So things like having a diagnosis of autism can help a child get services in the school. It can help a child access mental health resources that are out there in the world. So it's actually quite beneficial. And you can imagine that this also helps parents really think about, gaining that different type of support. They can go and they can research what autism is rather than talking about my child has social communication difficulties along with repetitive behaviors. But along with some of those advantages, there are some disadvantages to having these diagnoses and this label. Unfortunately, the way that we've conceptualized diagnosis is that we've conceptualized it within a child or within a person. So I have depression or I have anxiety means that I'm not taking into account everything that's happening. I'm sure during COVID, a lot of us have experienced more anxiety than we have before. Yet, when we're talking about a diagnosis, I might be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, but that's within me rather than looking at the circumstances that are around me. This might also be the case for a child who's been, abused, and that might show up with different types of disorders, but really it's kind of that family system or the abuse that's happening that might lead to some of those behaviors. As I was saying before, there's also either you have the diagnosis or you don't. So if you're showing some threshold or not enough symptoms, that potentially might leave you without getting treatment. One of the reasons that might happen is actually the insurance companies here in the United States. So in order to get a lot of treatments, we actually have to have a formal diagnosis on the books. So rather than saying that there's problems with the parent-child relationship and that's what we're really trying to treat in a clinical setting, we have to say that child is suffering from XYZ disorder. So if you had subthreshold symptoms of something, you might actually have to receive a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis, in order to get treatment. There's also some subjective criteria along with our diagnoses, like clinically significant impairment. What does that mean, right? So if I were to say I'm impaired in schooling and my grades slip from an A on average to a B on average, is that clinically significant impairment? As we saw in that Isabella case study, I think she went from A's to C's and D's. And that now seems like a bigger jump. That might be more clinically significant. And we also know, unfortunately, that diagnosis leads to stigma. There's a lot of stigma out there about mental health. And I hope one of the things you get out of this class is that we shouldn't be stigmatizing this. Instead, let's get the help that we need or figure out ways to actually improve our mental health. Another thing that's really important when we're talking about diagnoses is this concept of comorbidity. This is another concept that we've talked about before, but I want to keep re-emphasizing this, that Comorbidity is just seeing two disorders at the same time in one individual. So things like anxiety and depression are often comorbid. We often see with one comes the other. But this comorbidity problem really makes it hard to figure out where are the boundaries. So for example, for anxiety and depression, generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder have a lot of symptoms that overlap. This is really important when we're talking about, can we get the right diagnosis? So we have to really think about what diagnosis does this child actually have, because it might make a difference to our treatments, for example. So if you've ever watched the television show House, here's a basic House episode. So what's his problem? And they're guessing different types of diseases here. And that's one of the things that we really have to do when we're doing assessments with a child. What different disorder does this child have? Do they have multiple? Do they just have one? And how is it presenting in that child? So we might be asking ourselves, is this OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, or is this autism? That repetitive behaviors may look pretty similar in OCD and autism. So some of you were talking about that rocking back and forth, for example, in that child. That could be that child is doing a ritual in order to reduce the sensations of anxiety that they're feeling about something. So that might be more of that obsessive compulsive disorder. Or it could be autism, where you see that child self-soothing. So overall, one of the things with diagnosis and assessment is to really have this case formulation. We want to know what's causing the disorder, what's maintaining this disorder, and really, why is this person having this type of problem right now? And all of that is to say that this will guide our treatment. If I know that that child is dealing with depression, that there's parent-child interactions that are fueling that depression, then I might think about how can I use treatment to treat that parent-child interaction difficulties that they're having. Or if I think it's more of a biological thing, so everybody's had depression in this family forever, then maybe I could treat it with some biological measures like antidepressant. So those are the things that we really are thinking about with that case formulation. So in our next video, we'll talk a little bit more about treatment.